Random House Audio presents The Juice, Vinous Veritas by J. McInerney. This is J. McInerney. The Juice. What is better than to sit at the table at the end of the day and drink wine with friends, or substitutes for friends? James Joyce. It all began with Hemingway, as so many things do. Specifically with The Sun Also Rises, or, as the Brits call it, Fiesta. The latter title being apposite because part of what I carried away from that book in my youth was the sense that drinking wine was cool and sophisticated. And let's face it, this is one of the reasons we read books, especially in our youth, particularly books by Hemingway and Kerouac and Lawrence Durrell, to find out how to live and how to pose and where to travel and what to eat and drink and smoke along the way. Everybody in Hemingway's first novel is drinking wine. Not long after my vicarious adventures in Pamplona, this sense of wine as an appurtenance of the well-lived life was reinforced by Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, with Charles Ryder and Sebastian Flyte picturesquely draining the cellar at that estate over the course of a summer. I was so fixated on the wine and the scenery that I don't think I bothered to grasp the nature of their friendship. Not very Hemingway-esque, but again, for some reason, I remember the wine. The fact that wine had no place on my parents' suburban dining table seemed to confirm its consumption as a mark of sophistication. They and their friends drank cocktails, martinis, Manhattans, old fashions, and stingers. And when they drank enough of them, they behaved badly, especially when they were in their stingers period, though this didn't strike me as romantic or chic. Much later, I realized they were acting like the people in John Cheever stories once I finally got around to reading them. In fact, it took me years to appreciate his writing, in part because his characters resembled my parents and their friends. Hemingway was a great fan of Spanish rosado, which might be why, on my very first date at the age of 16, I ordered a bottle of Mateus Rosé, the spritzy Portuguese pink that came in a Buddha-shaped bottle. Never have I felt quite so worldly as I did that night at the Log Cabin restaurant in Lenox, Massachusetts, as I sniffed the cork and nodded to the waiter. Many of my college romances were initiated over a bottle of Chateauneuf du Pape, the only red wine whose name I could remember. But while lurching toward adulthood, I preferred quicker fixes, partly in the semi-conscious belief, suggested by so much of my reading, that the road of excess would lead to the palace of wisdom, that the pursuit of an artistic career as a writer required a strictly Dionysian regimen. Manhattan in the early 80s was a congenial venue for this aesthetic program, especially if your role models included Baudelaire, Dylan Thomas, Keith Richards, and Tom Verlaine. I worked at menial editorial jobs and briefly as a fact-checker for The New Yorker, as I did my best to infiltrate the downtown nightclub scene, which I imagined to be the contemporary equivalent of Isherwood's Berlin or Lautrec's Montmartre. Not long after I was fired by The New Yorker, I was awakened at the crack of 2 p.m. by a call from my best friend, who informed me that Raymond Carver was en route to my apartment. You could have knocked me over with a rolled-up $20 bill, several of which were lying on my bedside table. Jesus Christ, Raymond Carver on my doorstep? Granted, there was some context here. My best friend, Gary Fisketjon, a junior editor at Random House, had reviewed a chapbook by Carver for the Village Voice, and, through his legendary champion Gordon Lish, had gotten to know him. He would later become Carver's editor, as well as my own. Some years before, when we were at Williams College, I lent Gary a book called Will You Please Be Quiet Please, and since then we had both been passionate Carver fans. Now Gary was returning the favor with interest. They had lunch together, and Carver had nothing to do until his reading at Columbia that evening, so Gary volunteered my services as a tour guide for the afternoon, assuming that I would be thrilled. Which I was, despite an apocalyptic headache. The buzzer rang, an indistinct mumble came through the intercom, and then the doorway was filled by this hulking, slouching bear whom I ushered into a tiny Greenwich Village apartment that showed all the signs of an arduous, recently terminated binge. We never got around to touring the city and instead talked for 4 or 5 hours, mostly about writing, until it was well past time to get Carver to his reading. At some point he said, almost apologetically, "I don't know, the life you're living here doesn't seem exactly conducive to writing." While it didn't take a master storyteller to make this observation, from him it sounded like an epiphany. Carver knew whereof he spoke, a devotee of Alcoholics Anonymous who credited that organization with saving his life. 6 months later, I moved to Syracuse to study with Ray and clean up my act. Having heard nutritionists distinguish between good fats and bad fats, I would propose a similar dichotomy for intoxicants. Certainly this was the opinion of Thomas Jefferson, the nation's first wine geek. "No nation is drunken where wine is cheap," he declared, "and none sober where the dearness of wine substitutes ardent spirits as the common beverage. It is, in truth, the only antidote to the bane of whiskey." Or vodka, I might add. One can't help but wonder how different Russia's history might have been if the country was warm enough for viticulture. "Wine is one of the most civilized things in the world," Hemingway wrote in Death in the Afternoon, "and one of the natural things of the world that has been brought to the greatest perfection, and it offers a greater range for enjoyment and appreciation than possibly any other purely sensory thing." Not his greatest prose, perhaps, and like so many encomiums to wine, the Ernest Jefferson's springs to mind, it leaves out the buzz factor. They don't, for example, call them winos for nothing. Still, it impressed me at the time, especially since I'd discovered that the bane of whiskey and the road of excess hadn't led me to any palaces at all. But Syracuse was leading me in far more rewarding directions, in large part thanks to Ray and Tobias Wolff demonstrating how to advance from apprenticeship into actual writing. To supplement my fellowship, tuition plus $4,000 a year, I worked as a clerk in the Westcott Cordial Shop, whose Princeton-educated proprietor had an extensive wine library and high hopes for the scabrous neighborhood's eventual gentrification. Here I could oscillate between the stories of Isaac Babel and Hugh Johnson's World Atlas of Wine, dip into the stock after finishing my shift, and gradually refine my rudimentary palate. This is also where I got the call, some 2 years on, that my novel had been bought by Random House, and a subsequent one from a guy who kept calling me babe and wanted to fly me out to Hollywood to meet with his fellow executives at Paramount. "We'll put you up at the Chateau Marmont," he said. "Is that good?" I asked. "It's better than good," he assured me. "John Belushi died there." Clearly he'd read Bright Light's Big City, or at least the coverage of the book, and formed an opinion of my bad habits. A decade later, I was able to merge these double-barreled habits of wine and writing. My friend Dominique Browning, in charge of resurrecting Condé Nast's House and Garden, knew of my developing Venus passion, invited me to do a monthly column, and proceeded to send me pretty much any place in the world where I thought there was a good wine story, a master-class education I am profoundly grateful for, and one that would be hard to imagine in this era of editorial budget slashing and what's beginning to look like the mass extinction of general interest publications. Indeed, somewhat ahead of the curve, House and Garden was shut down in 2007. Sad as I was about its demise and my friend's misfortune, I reasoned that it had been a hell of a good run. I'd never intended to write about wine for more than a year or two, and it was time to turn all my energies back to fiction. And so I did, until a couple of years later the Wall Street Journal came calling. A few of the following essays, much revised here, date back to Dominique's magazine, and most from my current gig. One of them, a review of Robert Mondavi's autobiography published in the New Yorker, seemed very much worth reprinting here in the wake of his passing. The world of wine would likely look and taste very different if not for Mondavi, whom I was fortunate enough to spend time with on several occasions. Heraclitus tells us you can never step into the same river twice, for other waters are ever flowing on to you. And likewise, it seems to me, you can never really drink the same wine twice. The appreciation of wine, for all that we might try to quantify it, is in the end a subjective experience. More than a poem or a painting or a concerto, which is problematic enough for the aesthetician, the 1982 La Mission.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?